Donald Trump says he wants peace in Ukraine. The problem is that so far, this peace has consisted of making all sorts of concessions to Putin with virtually nothing in return. And he certainly hasn't been equally generous with Ukraine, a country that right now is fighting for a clear guarantee of security in order to avoid having to endure future invasions. But for now, all the concessions have gone to Russia. So far, Trump's peace strategy has been the opposite, to make Ukraine weak and force it to surrender its territory. Because it makes sense that it's easier to put pressure on the weak than on the strong. In fact, that led him to temporarily suspend the supply of intelligence and the delivery of weapons, a suspension that has now been lifted after the latest meeting in Jeddah, in which Kyiv has accepted a 30-day ceasefire, but this has had consequences.
Ukraine losing the war in Kursk, with Russia quick to exploit Trump's decision to blind battlefield intelligence.
The mistake was so monumental that the White House has even run into a slew of Republican congressmen and senators calling them to order. And while that suspension has now been lifted, let's not lose sight of what all these changes have meant. The fact is that the US is no longer a safe ally for Zelensky. Fortunately for Ukraine, an alternative is emerging that could perhaps make a decisive contribution to ensuring that when the war is over, Russia doesn't wake up one day and try to invade them again by land, sea, and air.
Emmanuel Macron says Europe must be ready to defend Ukraine without US assistance.
So far, US assistance has been crucial to the Ukrainian military effort. But let's be clear, the United States is not the only country that has collaborated with Ukraine. Contrary to what Trump touts day in and day out, Europe has actually given the most aid to Ukraine to date. And not only that, unlike Washington, both European governments and the European Union itself plan to deliver twice as much in the future as they've already given so far. I'm talking about amounts already committed. So now the question is, if the United States disengages from Ukraine, could Europe ever fully compensate for the US contribution? Let me stress here that the Ukraine problem will not end, even when this war is over. Well, let's see. It's clear that it won't be because of money. European politicians have plenty of funds. However, money is not everything. Preparation and production capacity are also needed. You see, for the last few decades, Europe has been living under the military umbrella of the United States, which has made European governments lose interest in military spending somewhat. They didn't see a clear threat either. Of course, you all know how this story ended. Right now, European countries, despite having 8 times the GDP of Russia and much more technology, have been forced to go on a defense spending spree because their armed forces are under-equipped to the point of ridiculousness. Visualeconomik community. In recent years, we have come to see things like this.
Germany's army is so under-equipped that it used broomsticks instead of machine guns.
So you see, you can have a lot of money, but without a military, you're going nowhere. For instance, remember that without the United States, the weapons sent to Ukraine would depend on the European military industry, an industry that has been languishing for years. Likewise, without a military core capable of providing advanced intelligence or logistical support, it's also difficult for assistance to be truly effective. And again, these are not things that will be fixed overnight by simply passing a budget. No, Europe needs to make a radical turnaround to enable both its armies and its industry to be at the forefront of warfare. And let's see, this is something that has been changing for a few years now. Defense spending in the Eurozone is on the rise after 15 years of complete stagnation. And in 2024, 21 of the 29 European NATO members had already reached the 2% spending level, and the vast majority are raising it to much higher levels than those figures. The problem, of course, is that not all countries cooperate equally. For example, Poland, with one of the most active armies in Europe, offsets others that contribute much less to European security, such as Spain. Nevertheless, European leaders have already made it clear that things have to change. Without going any further, the Dutchman and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has said that the 3% must be exceeded. But following that, just a few weeks ago, a bombshell news story came out. The European Union is going to promote the spending of up to 800 billion euros so that European countries can catch up.
EU chief unveils €800 billion plan to rearm Europe.
As we've said, not everything is money, but this is certainly money that is needed for building a proper armed force in old Europe. The question is, will that really be possible? How on earth is the European Union going to raise military spending so much if many countries are already in over their heads? Can Europe really rearm to compete with a military like the US? In this video, we tell you all about it. Let's start with this news item. Do you remember hearing it?
Pentagon proposes $50 billion in annual cuts and identifies priorities to expand. The Pentagon has proposed cutting 8% of its budget in each of the next 5 years.
It's a new story that went viral a few days ago, and yet it's fake. What's more, it's a perfect example of what is known as Chinese whispers or telephone. The White House asked the Secretary of Defense to reorganize the budget items. The Washington Post interpreted it as a cut, and other media outlets spread the story without verifying the matter too much. So no, there won't be any budget cuts. We are simply going to reduce expenses in some items in order to increase them in others. And what items does Trump want to invest in? Well, in the Defense Secretary's list, we find things as disparate as border security, cybersecurity, autonomous attack systems, renewing the nuclear arsenal, and well, there is a section called munitions, so I guess munitions in general. In fact, Congress is generally in favor of increasing military spending. Roger Wicker, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and a Republican politician, commented that it was perfectly feasible to increase the defense budget by another $200 billion to deal with China and Iran. Of course, this does not mean that there cannot be other cuts. There is, without going any further, Elon Musk. The new vice president in the shadows is tasked with cutting public spending, no matter what, with his new Doge agency. Will he succeed? Well, we'll talk about that in a future video, but for now, while Musk has already talked about auditing the Pentagon, there's not much to cut back on. It's true that the US has had episodes of real military waste, like everything surrounding the F-35. But let's be honest, those are not problems that are typically solved with a simple audit, and in general, the US military complex is quite efficient. Of course, there is inefficient spending and corruption, but it's much less significant than most people think. Do you want an example? Well, I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times that the US goes around seeding wars so that its military companies can make a fortune. And one thing is certain, half of federal defense spending does go to companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and General Dynamics, among others. For example, between 1990 and the 2000s, the percentage of money that went in contracts to the 5 largest arms companies grew from 20% to 30%, largely because many companies decided to merge rather than compete with each other. The result? News stories like this.
How the Pentagon falls victim to price gouging by military contractors. In 2015, a review discovered Lockheed Martin and its subcontractor Boeing were grossly overcharging the Pentagon and US allies by hundreds of millions of dollars for the Patriot's PAC-3 missiles. Pentagon analysts found the total profits approached 40%.
Now wait a minute, because this news is all well and good, but when a group of economists studied the issue in depth, their conclusions were very, very different.
First, contract spending did not increase in product markets that experienced higher increases in concentration. Second, acquisition programs run by contractors that consolidated did not see a differential change in per-unit acquisition costs.
I know this may sound very paradoxical, but the truth is that there is a very simple explanation. A few companies have the oligopoly of military contracts, yes, but the federal government has a virtual monopoly of being a client of these companies. This is what in economics is called monopsony. For example, 70% of Lockheed Martin's revenues depend directly on the US government, and naturally, if you depend so much on one buyer, then obviously that buyer is going to have a lot of power to negotiate and put downward pressure on prices. Be that as it may, what is really important is that it doesn't look like the US is going to cut its defense spending. The US military complex will continue to function as before, at least as far as spending is concerned. But as we've said before, it's not all about money. One question we have to ask is who the US military industry works for. And the answer is that apart from the federal government, one of its best customers is Europe. And here, Trump could make a difference. Just a few months ago, China cut off supplies to Skydio, one of the largest American drone manufacturers. This means that depending on a foreign power, to guarantee your military supply can be very costly. And in this case, it's obvious. China and the US are enemies. But the point is that in the future, the US could do exactly the same with Europe. Well, it's not that it could do it. It has already done it several times during the Ukrainian war. So the question that has now begun to sweep the old continent is, could Europe rebuild its own military industry and cut its dependence on the US? Well, let's take a look at it.
European rearmament.
Earlier, we said that the European Union has an economy about 8 times larger than that of Russia. Well, if we also add the United Kingdom, by how much more do you think European military spending exceeds Russian military spending? 8 times? 4 times maybe? Perhaps 50% higher? Well, no. Nothing like that. If we adjust spending by the price difference, that is in purchasing power parity, in 2024, Russia spent the same on defense as the entire club of 28. In fact, it spent a little more, $462 billion versus $457 billion. In just a couple of years, Russia has increased tank production by 220% and other artillery by 150%. But take note, don't imagine that all these tanks are the latest models. It's usually a case of Soviet-era tanks that have simply passed through a workshop to get them started. But this difference in military effort makes one thing clear. Europe has to spend more, and above all, it has to spend on its industry. If the objective is to compensate for the military aid to Ukraine that the US is currently providing, then it's very simple. Only 0.12% of the European GDP would be needed. In other words, very little would actually be required. However, to do so, a European army will have to be rebuilt, basically for 3 reasons. Of all the expenditure Europe spends on defense, only 1/3 goes to what amounts to the purchase of new equipment and armaments, and barely 13% of this third goes to the development of new military technologies. Here, allow me to digress. Surely many of you know DARPA, the research agency of the US Department of Defense. This agency has been behind inventions that have given the US a fierce military power, and also they've worked on everyday tools. We're talking about things like the internet, GPS, and various types of radars. And what about Europe? Well, the closest thing is JEDI, an agency that keeps repeating how tremendously inspired it is by DARPA. Well, guess what? It doesn't even focus on military spending. What's more, DARPA has only needed $60 billion to invent everything we've listed and much more. JEDI, despite being much newer, only 7 years old, has already received $85 billion in funding, more than DARPA in its 60-year history. And the results? Well, the only project they've completed has to do with COVID, and it wasn't even super important for developing vaccines. Mind you, this is not to say that the US military spending is so productive that it funds itself. This is not true. Military spending, as a whole, does not stimulate the economy. And if you don't want to take my word for it, look at the case of South Korea, which is an incredibly innovative country, which spends a lot on defense and has a pretty good incentive to spend well.
Military spending shows a negative and statistically significant impact on investment. The overall economic effects of defense spending on growth are negative, although they seem to be indirect or delayed.
And no, in the United States, military spending as a whole is not positive for the economy either. In fact, it becomes more negative as the time goes by. Europe needs to innovate in the military sector, yes, but let's not think that rearmament is going to finance itself. In other words, we're going to have to dig deep into our pockets, and above all, give up certain things that we like very much in Europe. Be that as it may, and going back to the previous topic, if only 1 in 3 euros spent on the military goes to replenishing armaments, investment in new technologies, and all that, where does the rest of the money go? Well, there are many items, but one of the most significant is salaries. Naturally, salaries of active soldiers, but also the pensions of retirees, which appear as military spending. I don't know, perhaps in the EU they think that the war with Russia will be settled with a tank tournament. But let's be honest, counting pensions as military spending is basically a ruse started by the US to fatten its military budget. Whatever the case, the problem is that part of this increase in spending is not going to make us better defended. In Spain, for instance, the government wants to increase military spending by raising the salary of all military personnel by 200 euros. It may make sense to raise their salaries, especially since they had been frozen for some years, but that shouldn't count as productive defense spending. And this problem is closely related to the next one. Money, by itself, does not win wars. Money is a means to have weapons, tanks, state-of-the-art missiles. In short, it's a means to wage war. Europe has 1.5 million active soldiers, but what weapons are those soldiers going to use? And what ammunition? Because according to a study by a German research center, at this rate, Germany will not finish renewing its howitzer arsenal to the level it had in 2021 until the year 2121. Yeah, that wasn't a mistake, you heard that correctly. Fortunately, tanks are going much faster. They'll only have to wait until 2066. Right now, Europe doesn't have an industry capable of converting all those tons of euros into weapons of war. Of course, it could buy everything it needs from the US, and even diversify somewhat with countries like South Korea. But of course, we're back to the same old problem. The US may not be an enemy, but we cannot depend on Uncle Sam for everything. The solution must be to create an industry of our own. For security reasons, for reasons of interest, and because of the new role that Europe will have to assume in regards to Ukraine. And here I want to make one thing clear. A lot of people, with all this reindustrialization stuff, tariff. They love it. But in the long run, this industry isn't going to generate wealth. It's going to be a cost to make war, or at least to deter Putin from starting one. What's more, reindustrializing the European military sector means returning to harder jobs that will ultimately depend on taxes. And this brings us headlong into the third problem for European rearmament. How the hell is it going to be paid for? When Europe jumped in to help the US following 9/11, European countries had far less debt, inflation, and taxes than today. But now, raising military spending above 3% will inevitably imply a very strong increase in one of these three things. In general, with what European governments spend on all kinds of plans, but especially on social spending, there is little room for maneuver. It's true that there are some 90 billion euro bonds left that should have gone to the next generation funds, but as these funds are allocated slower than Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin, they are still available. But the 3% expenditure will have to be made every year, and this money is not even enough for popcorn. And don't think that financing all the spending is the only problem. Suppose European politicians agree on a formula to pay for all this funding, whatever it may be. Where will the new factories be built? If it's decided that the most efficient thing to do is to create a macro-industrial complex in France, don't you think Germany will protest and want some of the factories to generate jobs in their country? And let's not forget, there are politicians like Orban blocking decisions that have to be taken unilaterally, so let's not even get started. Here, the most important thing is time. And we cannot do it with meetings where the only thing that is agreed on is to post a tweet saying that this is a wake-up call for Europe and that we are deeply concerned. The positive side is that Ukraine is not only dependent on Europe, it could also help Europe itself, and it can do so in several ways. First, it has the largest army in the old continent, except of course for Russia. It's an army with combat experience, and relatively cheap. So supporting Ukraine is the only right thing to do. It's an investment that could save us hundreds of billions of euros of military spending in the future. Let's hope that Europe, and not only Europe, will take a good lesson from this. But at this point, it's your turn. Do you think Europe can defend itself without depending on the US? Will all this spending be financed by more taxes, more debt, or more inflation? Could the member countries agree to do something immediately? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, see you next time.